All Hallows Eve is upon us. The days grow darker, and we're expecting snow. But things were hot this week at the Times-Union with the breaking of some major stories. On this episode of The Eagle, we'll go over those headlines.
It's just a horrible story of human destruction.
We'll hear about what it was like in the federal courtroom during NXIVM leader Keith Raniere's long-awaited sentencing.
Oh my God, 120 years, right?
We'll talk about the story of a popular state assembly aide who led a secret life as the leader of a local biker gang.
If you miss a meeting, it says it right in there, you can get an ass whooping.
And we'll hear the latest about how COVID-19 is affecting local schools.
It's starting to feel like, new normal.
This is The Eagle, a Times-Union podcast, a look inside our newsroom. I'm Jessica Marshall.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times-Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring in you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times-Union member today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome to The Eagle. I'm Jessica Marshall. Let's start with a look at what appeared in the Times-Union and on timesunion.com this week. We are here once again with Times-Union editor Casey Seiler. Big news week this week, lot to talk about. However, we'll start with the topic that seems to be the most relevant to everyone, if not most of our lives, and that is COVID-19, the second wave, or COVID-19 Part 2, the sequel. Can you give us kind of a summary of what the scene is right now with COVID-19?
Yes, the sequel nobody wanted, much like Exorcist II, The Heretic. There's a Halloween reference for you. Positivity rates are up. They are up in New York, not as much as they are in many of the kind of Midwestern states where there are definite spikes going on, but they're still up significantly in the capital region. If you look across the 8 counties, as Bethany Bump reported in print in Thursday's paper, the number of cases is just about 17 shy of what was the spring peak of 147 that was recorded at the very beginning of May. As she noted, the region has topped 100 new cases only 4 times this year, and 3 of them occurred in October. That's going in the wrong direction.
Certainly, and you can read Bethany's story and her ongoing coverage at timesunion.com. We are coming up, we're less than a week away from the election. What can we look forward to next week in terms of Times-Union coverage?
Well, I think everybody should look in Sunday's paper, and it'll be up online before that for what I'm expecting will be a really good story from Ed McKinley and Emily Munson. Emily is out of our DC bureau, offering sort of a guide for the perplexed and the anxious about what, based on the best evidence, we can expect will happen on Tuesday. Obviously, the sort of branching lines of what might happen could go on forever, but based on the law, based on what we know about early voting, based on what we know about the practices of local county boards of election, which are, of course, the building blocks, tens of thousands of them, of what's going to happen, we can make some predictions about how it's going to go and what we're likely to know on Tuesday night, around midnight or 1 o'clock, and what we might have to wait to find out in the days to follow.
And it goes without saying, bookmark timesunion.com, check back early and often, et cetera, because there will be a lot to report and a lot to talk about in next week's podcast, I'm sure, as well.
Jess, have you voted yet?
I have voted. I voted on Monday.
Good for you.
Let's move on to perhaps the biggest topic of the week. I mean, arguably, it is of national significance, the sentencing of Keith Raniere. We, on our sister podcast, NXIVM on Trial, talk at length about what happened. But Casey, do you want to kind of set us up? What happened this week?
The leader of NXIVM, the guru known within the organization as Vanguard, as expected, got a life sentence. Specifically, he got 120 years in federal prison. He is 60 years old, so that's effectively a life sentence. It was a remarkable scene where many of Raniere's victims, as well as victims of his organization, stepped up, confronted him in many cases for the first time. Most of them women, several of them victims of his sexual abuse, including the first speaker was a young woman from Mexico whose family fell into NXIVM's maw. She ended up being groomed for abuse by Raniere at a very early age, 13, I believe. And then he began having sex with her at the age of 15 and took pornographic images of her, a moment that provided one of the most dramatic and for the jurors terrible when they were obliged to look at the images that Raniere had taken of this teenager. She is now 30 years old. So it's just a horrible story of human destruction.
Indeed. And our own Rob Gavin was in the courtroom this week to witness the sentencing and all of those victim impact statements. And before I let you go, Casey, thank you so much for joining us. And we will hear a segment of your discussion with Rob and managing editor Brendan Lyons from our sister podcast, NXIVM on Trial.
Rob, it went on for hours. If you could elevator pitch it for us, how did yesterday go?
I think in many ways it went as expected, a little bit different. I think in the sentencing, I think we probably expected him to get a classic life sentencing, which is what he got. But Judge Nicholas Garafis, imposed a 120-year sentence on Keith Raniere. He's 60 years old. This just in, most humans don't live to be 120.
Yeah.
And 180 alone. So he would need to double his age and then do another 60 years. Very powerful statements coming from several former NXIVM members, including a 15-year-old girl in 2005 who Keith Raniere sexually assaulted and whom he kept child pornography of. And that woman's now 30 years old. She started it off. And what I thought was most significant is, nobody in the courtroom, at least nobody who covered the trial, has met this woman. We haven't seen her. She was a mystery. She was a huge part of the testimony. But until very recently, when we reported that she was going to appear and likely deliver a statement, we weren't even sure that she was necessarily out of DOS, which she was in for a long time as Keith Raniere's quote-unquote number one slave. And she gave a very powerful statement, which to me, really shed a lot of light on where she's at, where she was, where she is now, including a stunning revelation that when she told Keith Raniere she tried to take her own life, he had said to her, "Do you have any idea how bad that could have been for me?" Really just showing the self-absorbed nature of Keith Raniere. And that was, what was interesting is in that woman's statement and many statements, you saw a mix. There were people calling him, for instance, Sarah Edmondson called him a predator, a parasite, a grifter. Mark Vicente called him shallow. At times it was really, you could tell people who knew him as a quote unquote intellectual really wanted to dress him down for the shallow nature of some of these sexual escapades, illegal ones that he tried to do. And I think one of the more powerful statements came from, I mentioned that there was the woman who was 15 when he began sexually assaulting her. Well, she's one of three sisters who became sexually involved with Keith Raniere. Her middle sister is a woman who also had sexual relations with Keith Raniere, and that woman was the one who was confined to a room with no human contact for nearly 2 years, all because she dared to kiss another man. Her statement to Keith Raniere was very powerful in that she basically told him, "You don't matter. You're not someone who's ever going to be remembered. Yes, you're being remembered now, and now they're talking about you, but you're just one of many bad guys, so to speak." And that was a very powerful statement for someone as narcissistic as Raniere to be told, "You don't matter," I thought came across extremely effective.
When the time came for Raniere to speak, to set the scene, he's dressed in kind of black federal prison garb. he essentially attempted what I think is fair to say was kind of the classic convicted person's non-apology apology, that I'm very sorry that this happened, but not really specifying any crime that he is acknowledging, right?
This was even beyond trying to straddle the fence. I mean, it really bordered on the absurd. He kept saying that he was deeply remorseful and I'm so sorry for the pain that I've caused. And then he said, blame me. Don't blame my co-defendants, Allison Mack, Nancy Salzman. He actually didn't mention Kathy Russell, which I thought was kind of interesting. But as he's saying that, as if he's taking the blame, he then says very soon afterward, basically all the victims are liars. What you're saying isn't true. This is just not factual. It's not true, but I feel bad and I feel pain. And by the way, what you're saying is not true. And so going back and forth, and then throws in there, which, I mean, I think many of us knew this anyway. He mentions that Allison Mack cooperated. And I'm not sure why he felt the need to just drop that in there. But he mentioned that Allison Mack cooperated, which was not very public, but I think it was known to people who've covered the case. And so just a very, very inconsistent message from Keith Raniere. I thought he looked like he may have lost a little weight. His hair seemed a little bit grayer. He was back and forth, obviously, in his statements. And he went on for a while, and the judge didn't interrupt him. And I've seen this judge in the past, certainly with lawyers and with Claire Bronfman, kind of cut people off. He sort of let Raniere give his long speech and then obviously spoke with the sentence he imposed.
Brendan, any kind of last thoughts? Is, you know, Raniere's fall is now complete. This has been something that has been going on for decades. It's a story that the Times-Union has been covering for almost 2 decades now. You know, we went back and looked through the clips. The first mention of Keith Raniere in the Times-Union is, I think, from 1988, when he, you know, reported that he had won a kind of entrance into a mega genius organization. It's a rainy Wednesday morning, but it's also kind of the end of a very long road.
It is. It's arguably not illegal to run a cult, but there was so much information that the Times-Union and other news organizations laid at the feet of law enforcement and even the NXIVM, you know, devotees through the years. It was always shocking to me that this didn't happen sooner, and that it took branding and Raniere really coming off the rails and taking it to a new level for him to be outed. I think in many ways, when our 2012 series hit and Raniere was left standing, that it emboldened him to go further, to take this into an even deeper, darker place. Throughout all of this, my view of Raniere has been that he's someone with deep-seated mental health issues who I still believe that the reason he forced women in many ways to become emaciated, to stay under 100 pounds, that was always a theme throughout his career. If you look at many of the women he was with, rail thin, I still think he was trying to make them look like the middle school girlfriend who turned him down, and that he kind of, it shaped his life. And all of this, as Mark Vicente once said, he said suddenly the lights went on and he realized all they've been doing is guarding the door of a brothel for this guy. So it's just shocking to me that it went on for so long, and that even the NXIVM devotees didn't have an uprising sooner. That might have been his undoing.
It's really kind of amazing to look at like all the time and all the stories that the Times-Union has put out there, and the fact that this was out and it was in the public eye and everybody knew about them, and it just took this long. It is sort of amazing to think that, wow, we actually are at this time that Keith Raniere is going to prison for 120 years and he's never getting out bearing a successful appeal.
You can hear more about the latest in the ongoing NXIVM saga in our sister podcast, NXIVM on Trial. Visit timesunion.com or find it wherever you listen to podcasts. For more than a decade, a state assembly aide named Joseph Brady was a go-to for any matters involving labor for those who visited the Capitol. But this week, the Times-Union reported that he led something of a more sinister double life. A friendly and familiar face around the Capitol. Off duty, he was an unforgiving leader of a local motorcycle club known for its affinity for drug use and violence. Managing editor for investigations Brendan Lyons broke the story, and I talked to him about his reporting.
It's come to light that a respected assembly aide has been leading something of a double life, and that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So can you tell me, what's the story here?
A few months ago, I had heard whispers about this assembly aide, Joseph Brady, and he's a legislative director for Peter Abadi, who was a very long-standing Brooklyn assemblyman. And Abadi is a Democrat who chairs the Government Employees Committee, and in that position, they deal with most of the labor issues that come through the assembly. It's a very key, pivotal role. A lot of lobbyists, a lot of people deal with them. And Joseph Brady was a point of contact for the assemblyman. And I had heard that Brady had, initially I was looking into the fact that he also had these waste management companies that he set up for roll-off dumpsters, and that he had contracts with the state of some kind, and that there was an investigation of him. So I started digging into him a little bit, and come to find out that not only that, but he has another life where he is the founder or co-founder of the local chapter of a motorcycle club called East Coast Syndicate. And it turned out that these club members have been engaged in violence, have been a focus of law enforcement investigations, and that last year Brady was among those members who was questioned in connection with the disappearance of a Saratoga County biker whose vanishing is being treated as a homicide.
Sounds like the plot of Sons of Anarchy, right?
It does. And that's not the first time I've heard that.
So why is this really significant? I mean, he was arrested recently, right?
That's right. So I had the advantage of having gathered a lot of information on Mr. Brady when lightning struck last weekend. On October 24th, an 18-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy, her boyfriend, had been staying at Brady's Waterville residence. And my understanding from law enforcement sources is that that event had turned into a drug binge with methamphetamine and alcohol. And sadly, the 16-year-old boy's parents had brought him there for safekeeping in hopes of getting him into a rehab facility where there's a lot of lines now. It's not easy to get into those places. They put him there for safekeeping. He ends up in what appears to be a drug binge with Mr. Brady. And when the 16-year-old is dispatched with another person to go get more drugs, it is being alleged that Brady sexually assaulted the 18-year-old. And the FBI, Waterville Police, state police searched his residence. They found materials that looked like they were being used to make explosives. They did not find any weapons. They found a small amount of narcotics. And Mr. Brady, he's charged with sex abuse as well as some misdemeanor counts of endangering children and those sorts of things, and is in Albany County Jail being held on $50,000 bail.
So he really did lead a double life. I mean, in your article, you mentioned, the reactions that everybody had to him and the interactions that everybody had with him prior to this as an assembly aide, and he seemed like a completely different person, right?
Yep. They people who worked with him and knew him there described him as an affable guy, attentive and knowledgeable of the subject, the issues that would come before them, responsive to their needs, on labor issues, especially the police unions. And to them, it was a shock. They did not know that underneath his dress shirts were tattoos indicating his allegiance to more than one biker gang. He had been in a different biker gang in the past as well.
Now he's been fired from his position there, right?
Yes. The assemblyman announced Monday to us that he had fired him on Sunday, not long after the Times Union broke the story of his arrest and his connection to the state legislature.
And other than that, the assemblyman has been pretty mum, right, on the topic?
Yes, he is. I believe he's running unopposed next week for re-election. And interestingly, his folks said to me that he's too busy this week for a 5 or 10 minute telephone interview, but that he would be available next week, which happens to fall after the election.
Well, then, I guess we'll have that to look forward to. Now, another thing that you mentioned in your article, which I found kind of interesting, and perhaps this is a little superficial, but you talk about some of the rules that he set up for his biker gang, right?
It starts off sounding a little bit like Robert's Rules of Order, and then it sort of takes a left turn. But I think these guys really know how to run stuff, because if you miss a meeting, it says it right in there, you can get an ass whooping. They have rules for not messing with another member's wife, or as they say it, quote, old lady, unquote. And you have to pay dues. You can't you're not allowed to talk at meetings unless you're called upon. You're not allowed to do drugs or alcohol at meetings. They even have strict rules for their recruits, who they call ghosts. And ghosts must be 18 or older. And interestingly, although there appears to be a drug culture within this biker gang, the ghosts, the recruits, are not allowed to do drugs. Getting a hold of their bylaws was really a fascinating read.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, I can't help but compare it to my only experience with something like this, which is watching Sons of Anarchy. Now, has there ever been anything kind of like this that happened before that kind of has this connection between local biker gangs and, the state, or maybe like labor stuff? Or is this kind of a new thing?
I have not seen that intersection with state government. I have seen in the past the intersection between biker gangs and labor unions. That has come up before. I remembered years and years ago, one of our photographers had the Capitol underwent a years-long renovation, if you remember, the exterior of it, the state Capitol. And one of our photographers happened upon some construction workers who were sitting around in a circle, ostensibly on a break. And he took their photo and had their name. And what the photographer didn't know is that they were members of the Hells Angels, and that they had what were effectively no-show jobs. So at one point, they just wouldn't show up. And apparently under the arrangement, the supervisor had informed them, look, you don't have to do anything, but you at least have to show up. So they were on a day-long break, you could call it.
The Times Union also got a hold of a video recently that's on the story, and you can see it at timesunion.com, of members of this motorcycle club, the East Coast Syndicate, allegedly assaulting a teenager. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we were told, that the video was of. It was provided to us by someone who had connections with the group. The video and some photographs showed an incident from what we were told is the summer of 2019, in which the biker, gang members are on a street in Troy, and there's a melee. There seems to be a disturbance. You see two women who appear to be fighting at one point. And then it's brief, but you see this teenager who is stomped and hit by a couple of the club members. And we were told it was because he had been disrespectful to them. And as that's unfolding, there's one photo only that way off to the right, you see Joseph Brady, who is a leader of this group, who is standing there with his arms folded and his black motorcycle vest on, just watching everything unfold, but not taking part in it. So, that kind of gives you a sense of his leadership in the club, that he doesn't need to dirty his hands with what was really just a colorful and violent incident in broad daylight in the middle of Troy.
Yeah, and again, you can see this video, which, is somewhat graphic, on timesunion.com.
After the break, the latest on how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting Capital Region schools.
Hi, I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times-Union. Join us for an ongoing discussion on major developments in the saga of Keith Raniere, co-founder of NXIVM, the shadowy upstate New York organization at the center of the explosive federal investigation that resulted in his conviction on charges of extortion, sex trafficking, and more. We talked to former members of NXIVM, discuss the latest news, and preview the likely next twists in this bizarre and disturbing story. You can find NXIVM on Trial at timesunion.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
You're listening to The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. I'm Jessica Marshall. We're just under 2 months into the school year in the Capital Region. Many students continue to go to school in person, both at the grade school level and in higher education. But several local school districts have shifted classes to remote instruction, following the reports of school-related COVID-19 cases. Times Union education reporter Rachel Silberstein has been following the developments, and I caught up with her this week to get the latest.
A lot of news came fast and furious in the education realm this week locally in both, elementary and high school education, primary education, and higher ed. So can you, give us a 30,000-foot view of what the heck is going on with schools in the Capital Region?
Well, I think the week kicked off with news that, we saw over the weekend a pretty notable rise in COVID-19 cases. And several schools have had to move entire grades, classrooms, or grades online to stop the spread. Two of our largest suburban districts had pretty notable outbreaks, and they had to, clean buildings and transition to remote lessons at least temporarily so that they could, stop it. But, I did a little bit of research to see if there was cause for alarm. Is this statewide trend? I learned that part of the reason we're seeing more classrooms close is because local health departments have sort of evolved in the way they do contact tracing. Historically, they have treated anyone who has more than 10 to 15 minutes of contact with an infected person at a distance of less than 6 feet. They would be considered someone who's exposed, and that individual person would be notified. And now they've sort of evolved to quarantine the entire class.
Reading some of the stuff that you've written and some of the other reporters on the general COVID scene, one of the things that has come up is that a lot of school districts have voiced concern over differences in the way things are handled county by county, and there's some confusion at the state level. I mean, is that accurate?
That's right. We saw a lot of rural schools went completely remote after 1 or 2 cases, and then we'd see another school with seemingly the same circumstances, although we don't know all the factors, have a completely different outcome. And it's largely based on, local health authorities, when they deem it's appropriate to close a classroom or a school building. There has been a small rise as the weather got cooler. I think health officials say they expected this. They expected there to be somewhat of a rise in COVID-19 cases. So to an extent, this is a normal incline that they predicted at the start of the year, and they say that's why they're sort of erring on the side of caution when it comes to quarantining classrooms.
I dare say the school districts are feeling more confident, I guess that's fair to say, than they were, say, 6 months ago when everything kind of came to a grinding halt.
Yeah, I think they're sort of falling into a rhythm, and it's starting to feel like, new normal. And they're trying to be as transparent and communicative with families as possible, because I think, a lot of parents reflexively get concerned when the schools shut down or there's reports of cases. And so I think communication is key to keep parents' concerns at bay.
Sure. The news would be a whole lot different if we could predict the future. But I guess based on what you're seeing and what you're reporting, do you think that it's going to get worse, as the year progresses?
That's what health officials are saying. And they believe that once flu season hits, which is around Thanksgiving time, that's when we really have to worry, and we can expect to see a spike. Immune systems are down and people are getting sick anyway. And I think a lot of schools now keep their windows open to keep the air flowing smoothly, and they might not be able to do that anymore. So I think they are expecting an uptick in the winter. Whether or not that means we're going to see widespread school closures is still unclear. We also don't know what the timeline is for a vaccine. It's still month by month in terms of school and health officials acquiring new information and adapting based on that new information.
Let's move on to higher ed. Throughout the whole SUNY system, every student who is on campus in person must be tested for COVID before leaving for Thanksgiving break. What's the deal with that?
They announced it this week. They rolled it out. And some campuses have already had a very aggressive testing regimen where they're testing students, once or twice a week. And so for those campuses, they're fine because they already know the status of every student. But other schools will have to make sure that they are tested within this 10-day time frame before they go home for Thanksgiving. And if they aren't able to take a test in time, they just can't leave campus. And if they, sort of defy the order, that's like a violation of the COVID safety practices. So they're really, I think, going to be really strict about making sure kids are tested before they leave school. And we're seeing private colleges also in the region taking similar measures. Not every college has the same testing capability. Some of the smaller, liberal arts colleges in our area don't have the ability to test every single student, but they're trying to find other ways, like require them to get a test from a lab or show some sort of proof that they've tested negative for COVID before going home to their hometowns and home states and spreading the virus.
Has there been reaction to this? I mean, are students upset about this? Or faculty, family? Has there been any reaction whatsoever? Are most people on board with this?
I think there's like an understanding at this point that more testing is needed and aggressive testing is needed. I think the most aggressive testing program in the Capital Region has been at RPI, where they're testing every single student and faculty member on campus every 2 weeks. And they have probably conducted more tests than all the colleges in the area combined. I think they're nearing like 60,000, and they've only had 8 positive cases, which is really different outcome than colleges that weren't really strict about testing initially or didn't have a strong testing capability initially, which saw, we had several colleges with significant outbreaks, and the more they tested, the more cases were discovered. And we're seeing that an aggressive testing program is the way to prevent spread of COVID-19.
All right. Well, you can read all of Rachel's reporting at timesunion.com, and we will check back with her soon, I am sure. Thanks, Rachel.
That's it for this week. I'm Jessica Marshall. We'll be back next week with another look inside the newsroom here at the Times-Union. In the meantime, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram, or head over to timesunion.com for the latest news and features. Happy Halloween!